Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, as my kids and I gear up for a trip to Scotland, which we're all super excited about, we loved our first experience there and been itching to go back ever since. Thought it'd be a good time to dive into some Scottish history, but this is a unique video, I think. I actually don't know where he's going with this, but I've done a reaction in the past to the channel Scotland History Tours. I think that Bruce from this channel does a fantastic job of telling stories. In fact, that's how he sets up his videos. He always says, "Let me tell you a story." So I have not watched this video yet, but the title jumped out at me, and I thought it'd be an interesting topic to cover. It's why Scottish and American people see history differently. So I'll be very curious to know where he's going with this. I'll put the link in the description so you can check out his channel without my commentary. All the stuff he does relates to Scottish history, and he goes to the sites and tells stories about the things that happened in those places. So this should be a fun one to dive into. I want to thank Anthony in Harrisonville, Missouri. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon, Anthony. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Why do Scottish people and American people see history differently? If you don't think they do, then I'm here to tell you that you're wrong. In this video, I'm going to suggest why I think that is, but more importantly, I also want your opinion on the subject. I'm Bruce Fumi, and normally I take you to Scotland's wonderful scenery and historic locations to tell you about the people, places and events in Scottish history. If you're new to the channel, but you like stories from Scotland history, then you can click the red subscribe button at the bottom right. Now, the folk who are already subscribed now expect me to say, "Let me tell you a story," because that's what I normally do. This video is a little bit different, although I do have a story. This is Kenmore on the banks of Loch Tay. It's one of my favourite places in the world. But there's also a Kenmore in Washington State, USA. I assume people left here, crossed an ocean, then crossed a continent to build a new way of life all the way over on the other side of America.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about the United States, and it's not unique to the United States, is that we really, other than indigenous peoples who were here before Europeans came, for the most part, most of the people who are part of the United States today, our bloodline in this country doesn't go back more than a couple hundred years. And so I think that's what creates in Americans this unique longing to feel a connection to somewhere else, because for most of us, we have a connection to somewhere else. Now, in my case, most of my heritage goes back to the 16 and 1700s in this country. I don't have a lot of recent immigrant ancestry, but that's not true for a lot of people. Most Americans probably have somebody within 3 or 4 generations that came from somewhere else. So I think that's part of it, and I think then part of our culture is made up of all this mix of all these other cultures. That's true in a lot of other places too. England and Scotland, for example, have a lot of ties to France and Germany and Scandinavia, and that's going to be true in most cases.
I suppose that's why almost 30% of the people who watch this channel are from the USA, more than 5% from Canada. Anyway, about a month ago in February 2021, I noticed a comment under one of my videos. Now, the video was called "The Death of Robert the Bruce." It's one of my most popular videos. If you haven't seen it, you should. I'll leave a link at the end. A Scottish guy called Paul Maxwell commented, "I just came here to the comment section to see how long it would take before an American declares that they're related to Robert the Bruce." Laughy face, laughy face. Now, some Americans might get a little bit upset at that. In fact, they did. A guy called Great Red Spot. I'll be honest, I don't think that's his real name. I think he maybe just had some bad acne or something like that.
So yeah, I'm starting to get a sense of where he's going with this now, and that is, and I get this from a lot of Europeans, especially because I do talk a lot about my family tree and my connections to events and things like that. I don't want to say it's exclusively American that we are so interested in our heritage, but it does seem to be much more predominant among Americans than it does other things. And I think that part of it is what I referred to earlier, is that because Americans, by and large, our heritage comes from somewhere else, we're curious about that. And we want to know what that heritage is. So people in the United States are very proud to be Italian Americans or African Americans or Polish Americans or Scottish Americans or whatever it might be. We're very interested in where we came from. And so maybe that is a difference in how we see history.
Anyway, Great Red Spot, and I know it's a planetary reference, said, "Hey Paul, I am related to Robert the Bruce."
Like, so is everybody else.
So distantly, it's psst. Now I have no idea what psst means. It might be a young person's acronym. You know what they're like. 99% of my ancestors are Scottish who came to America in the 1600s. Is there something wrong with being an American who's related to Robert the Bruce? I got all the documentation. What's your problem?
So first of all, you don't really, I mean, you kind of have the documentation. If you can get back to somebody of some nobility, then yeah, you can do that. So, for example, I know for a fact that I am descended through an illegitimate daughter of King James IV of Scotland. But here's the thing, you go, and I'm sure he'll touch on this, you go back to the 1600s, you have as many ancestors as there were people on this planet. That's just the way ancestry works. So when I say that I'm descended from James IV, and therefore I'm descended from most other monarchs of the British Isles, including Robert the Bruce, yeah, it's true. It's also not that big a deal, because so is everybody else. They just might not know those connections, but they certainly exist. So I tend to downplay claiming my descent from famous people 1,000 years ago. I'm much more interested in my great-great-great-grandparents, because that's much more unique to who I am.
And to think I wasn't even going to mention it in the comments if not for you. Now, I was on Red Spot's side at first. Is it a bad thing being related to Robert the Bruce? No. Is it wrong for folks in the US to be proud of their Scottish roots? Of course not.
It's just not unique.
If you're watching Red Spot, philosophically, I was with you. Until you said 99% of your ancestors were Scottish, right back to the 1600s. I just lost faith. 99%? Over 400 years? That's a level of inbreeding that hasn't even been achieved in Fife. And they work at it. I think that's why...
I don't know much about Fife, but I wonder if anybody from Fife is offended by that.
They have the red spots. I don't think anyone in Scotland's got 99% Scottish ancestry.
That's a great point.
Think about how many ancestors you'd have between now and 1600. I just don't think that Red Spot's done the maths.
Okay, I love that he emphasized the S. In the United States, we say math, singular. In the UK, they say maths, which I guess makes sense. Mathematics, maths. Got no problem with that. I love that he emphasized it, though.
I have. Assuming a generation reproduces every 25 years, from 2 parents to 4 grandparents to 8 great-grandparents, you get the idea. Yeah. That's 131,070 ancestors. Now, leaving aside the supernatural level of inbreeding to go 400 years without extending the gene pool, 99% of 131,070 doesn't give you a whole number of people. And okay, 1 or 2 of them may have lost a limb or 2 in the French-Indian Wars, but I'm just not convinced. Now, let's not be harsh on Red Spot. What he was doing was exaggerating.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we're getting a little too hung up on the 99% thing. But he makes a fair point, is that no matter where your people came from, that place they came from isn't even 100% of that. You know, people in England don't have 100% English genealogy. They're going to have DNA that shows France and shows Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Germany.
Everyone does it. I've done it 1,000,000 times myself.
Just did it.
It's just that 99% was way too unrealistic, and it distracted me from giving the fulsome support that I wanted to.
Now, I feel like maybe he's now being too distracting by focusing so much on that 99% number. I get his philosophical point, but
kind of reinforce Paul Maxwell's suggestion that some Americans may make grandiose, overblown claims. Actually, I took the numbers a bit further. Assuming the same 25-year time frame between generations, if you go back to 1314 when Robert the Bruce was in his pomp, that's 28 generations and 536,870,910 ancestors. And I thought, if 99% are Scottish, one of them's got to be Robert the Bruce.
Yeah, and not only that, but the chances are very, very good that you have the same people appearing multiple times. You know, so just going back, so let's say Pocahontas. Pocahontas lived in the late 1500s, early 1600s. She appears in 3 of my 4 grandparents' ancestries. And in one of my 4 grandparents, she appears twice in their family tree. And that's just what I know about. So just somebody 400 years ago appears at least 4 different times in my family tree through 3 of my 4 grandparents. And again, saying, hey, I'm a descendant from Pocahontas through both my parents sounds really cool, but it's not that unique. I guarantee you there's probably 1 million people in the United States who are descended from Pocahontas. That's just the way maths work.
And if there were that many Scots kicking about, no wonder we won the Battle of Bannockburn, eh? That's what I thought. It's not what I said. Partly because I knew all 536,870,910 ancestors wouldn't have been alive at the same time in 1314, but more so because I could see a social media spat kicking off. I spend so much of my time worrying about a rammy between pro and anti-independence Scots, I let a stooshy about Scots and Americans' different view of history slip under the radar. Just one of the many things invented by a Scotsman. The point is that whilst Americans are rightly thinking, who does that cheeky jumped up jock think he is? I'm proud of my ancestry. Scots are probably thinking, aye, claiming Robert the Bruce was your granddad's exactly the type of thing that Americans would do. I'm here to calm those transatlantic waters.
Interesting. Yeah, so I think there's just a difference in how, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I think it's difficult for Europeans and Americans to understand each other on this issue because Americans do have this, because our country's as new as it is, we have this desire when we start thinking about our ancestry to know what other countries we're connected to. You know, if you are a part of a country like France that's been around for more than 1,000 years, it's easier to feel like you're a part of something. And you know, if your great grandparents were all French, yeah, you kind of figure that you're just 100% French. Americans don't really have that for the most part.
I'm going to tell you what I think, then I'm going to ask you, both Scots and Americans, to tell me what you think without a stooshy in the comment section below. Now, for the benefit of the non-Scots, a stooshy is an altercation that's less heated than a rammy.
Oh, okay. Then a rammy.
The Sarajevo assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was a stooshy. World War I was a rammy. The point is that I think Scots and Americans do see history differently.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't done a scientific survey, and this video will be littered with gross generalisations, massive oversimplifications, and outright speculation.
I'm so glad he added that caveat there, because anytime we're talking about, okay, for example, saying Scottish and Americans, the Scots and Americans see history differently, that can be a generalization. If 80% of Americans see it that way, then we could say that. The other 20% might see history the way that most Scots do, or maybe people altogether differently than either of those.
99% of which are true. But the comment sections underneath my videos give lots of anecdotal evidence.
Yeah.
You see, Americans look at Scottish history and say, what did my ancestors do?
Yeah.
Scots look at Scottish history and say, what did the English do to my ancestors?
That's fair.
Now, obviously, this is an oversimplification. Some Americans do say, what did the English do to my ancestors? And Scots say, I'll tell you what the English did. I'm just saying. In general, Americans are emboldened by our history. Scots are embittered.
That's fair.
Talking about Americans isn't quite correct. It's not just Americans. To varying degrees, it's people from North America. And it may be that the bigger population makes it seem like United States Americans do it more, or it might be a genuine attitude difference. But I want you to tell me your thoughts in the comment section.
Interesting. A lot to think about here.
So my anecdotal observation is that Scots are way more concerned about what happened to Scots as a people. Americans are more concerned about their particular ancestors. Less emphatically, I think that Scots are more likely to associate themselves with downtrodden, ordinary people. Americans are more likely to associate themselves with a celebrity or a royal.
Now, I will say this, as I'm trying to process everything he's saying here, because there's a lot to take in. And in general, I agree with him. And so I'm trying to offer my perspective as an American who's deeply interested in his ancestry. Again, it goes back to the idea that Americans, by and large, we are made up of people who came from other places. And while that's true in other places as well, it's much more obvious to us that that's the case because we know that has to be the case. Unless you are full-blooded Native American, indigenous ancestry that goes back thousands of years in North America, you know that your people came from somewhere else. If you're Scottish and you're, like I said, and your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents were all Scottish, you identify yourself as Scottish. And so you see everything through the collective memory. Whereas, because I have ancestors who were Scottish and German and Swedish and Native American and English and Welsh and Irish, I tend to look at my connection to those places through the individuals who give me my Irish heritage and my Scottish heritage. I agree with him that we do see it differently, but it makes sense to me that we see things differently because of all of that.
You're wrong. The desire for prestige is a pretty universal human quality. I've never yet had somebody comment, "Aye, my 9 times great granny was one of the prostitutes who serviced Jacobite troops on the road to Derby, and my 18 times great granddad was the guy who slept in and missed the Battle of Bannockburn." People don't tend to make those kind of claims. To be honest, I think that Scots are less likely to even know who their 18 times great granddad was. But Americans and Canadians will give a description about how their family crossed the Atlantic with names and dates and what they had in their suitcase.
Yep.
So, why is this? Here's what I think. Number one, there may be a simple explanation that Americans/Canadians/colonials who are interested in Scottish history are by definition a subset of the Venn diagram who are going to be more interested in tracing their ancestry. They're not representative of Americans in general. In fact, maybe Americans are no more interested in their ancestors than Scots. 2, most Scots look back to Highland clearance as a bitter loss and an end of a culture.
Yeah.
To Americans looking back, that period can now be seen by survivors as a genesis.
Also, though, I think that much of that Scottish history, like the Highland clearances and even the Jacobite Rebellion and a lot of that clan warfare that's going on, some of that takes place after many of our ancestors already came to the United States. And so we don't have that part of our history entwined with the Scottish. By the time the Highland clearances happened, most of my ancestors who were Scottish, and I have a lot of Scottish ancestry, were already in America. The ties between the Scots and the Americans go back very deeply, especially for people in the American South. With my family tree coming primarily through eastern Kentucky and before that from Virginia, North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, that area was heavily settled by what we call Scots Irish. They were either people who came from Scotland or they were Ulster Scots. They were those those Scots who had settled Ireland and maybe spent a few generations in Northern Ireland and then came to the United States and claimed Irish ancestry, but really they were Scottish. And they brought a lot of that clan identity with them. And that's why you see in places like Kentucky, you have these feuds. You have the Hatfields and the McCoys between Kentucky and West Virginia, but even more than that, in my family tree, my great-grandmother was a Holbrook, and the Holbrook-Underwood feud was one of the deadliest in American history. They brought that clan warfare with them from Scotland to the American South, but they also brought that identity that says that big government is the enemy. The English and what they did to Scotland, they brought that with them to the United States. And that's why there's such a heavy predominance of people who are states' rights view of American government. And that existed before the American Civil War. It exists to this day. The party identity changes, but the idea of small government, states' rights, the government is my enemy, was brought with them. So that connection to Scottish heritage exists to this day.
I think that's why Americans are really interested in clan history, whereas Scots are more interested in medieval struggles or Enlightenment ingenuity. Although there may be modern politics at play as well.
Yeah, that's fair.
3. America is a newer and more diverse country. Individuals search for a sense of self and belonging in their ancestry, whose arrival in America was recent enough that they can trace records. Scots just tend to accept that we've kind of always been here.
Yeah.
Our ancestors
100% agree with everything he just said, and everything I've been saying, absolutely true. He's hit the nail on the head with that.
Ones that never bothered to leave. Hey Tam, what did your ancestors do during the building of the diaspora? Och, they just sat in the house and watched the telly, eh? Hibs were playing Hearts in the Cup final, eh? Doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? Incidentally, Hibernian FC and Heart of Midlothian are soccer teams that play in Edinburgh.
Did he just say soccer teams that play in Edinburgh? Now you're just toying with us, Bruce. Yeah, and I did a video on many of the players who played football for Hearts in Edinburgh in my video about McRae's battalion over on Stories of the Great War, so you should check that out.
4. I do think there's a deeper cultural reason that a Scottish guy somewhat impolitely mocked Americans claiming descent from our great historical figures. And it's that in Scotland, everybody knows from whom they come. Jock Tamson. Even somebody like me whose dad's West African knows that his nth time great granddad was Jock Tamson. Now for the non-Scots, we have an expression that we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. That is to say, don't get above yourself because you're no better than anyone else.
Yeah.
We all have the same common ancestor.
So I get this point, and this makes sense because there are a lot of people who have a very visceral negative reaction to people talking about their famous ancestors. And I've been guilty of talking about my famous ancestors and my family tree many, many times, as you guys know. But I always put the caveat in there that I point out, it doesn't make me special that I have those ancestors. Everybody's got those interesting and famous ancestry. I just know about mine. It doesn't make me more special, and it doesn't mean anything that I'm a 14th great-grandson of James IV of Scotland. It means nothing. So are millions of other people. It's just cool. It gives me a cool connection to history, and it makes me more interested in James IV because I know he's my ancestor.
Not Robert the Bruce, he's not King James IV, he's not the second cousin of Bonnie Prince Charlie twice removed.
He just mentioned King James IV! Alright, sorry. Calm yourself down. Alright.
He's just plain old John Thompson. Don't mistake that for John Thomas. He's a dick and he's English. 5. Take points 3 and 4 together, and America's a country built on individualism and go-getters going and getting, and we've got this because my grandpappy built the thrust and vibrancy of a nation, whereas his brother stayed home in Fife and worked down the pit, eh? His brother remained in East Central Scotland and worked in the coal mines. But they're both Jock Tamson's bairns.
Great point. Great point.
So, two culturally different descendants of Jock Tamson, both fiercely proud of their Scottish heritage, clashed in my comment section. To me, as Scottish a Scottish African as you'll get, it's a genuine joy and privilege to take you to our beautiful places, to tell Scots of the home country or the diaspora stories about our history. In a moment, I'm going to put up a link to that video about the death of Robert the Bruce that started this controversy in the first place. But in return, I've got a task for you. Whether you agree or disagree with me on anything that I've said, please give your thoughts in the comment section below. More than any other, I'm genuinely interested to know if you think Scots are more communal than individual, are Americans more interested in ancestry, do we pay too little attention to our history? Do you have your own theory? And hey, don't upset each other.
That was good. That was a great video, and I think that while I didn't agree with every single point that he made, the overarching point that he's trying to make with that video, 100% agree with. And it's always difficult for us because we all, as I mentioned all the time, we all have our biases. We all have our worldviews that vary wildly depending on how we were raised, what our socioeconomic status is, our race, our religion, our political views, our experiences, the trauma we've had in our life. It all affects how we see things. And so his view might not be the same as mine and might not be the same as other Americans or other Scots. But I thought it was a really cool topic, and I'm glad that he covered it, and I would love to hear what you think about that. Let me know in the comment section below. And before we wrap this video up, I want to thank Dale Switzer and Battle Boyd. No address for either one of you, but thank you so much for your support on Patreon. Could not do this without you. Check out some of these other videos. Thanks for watching.